There is an episode of South Park that aired the night after Barack Obama won the 2008 presidential election. And in it, the new president and the man he had just defeated meet alone in a dark room and quietly reveal that they have been working together for decades, that the entire campaign was a heist, and that the speeches and the debates and the long night of returns were cover for a job no civilian was ever meant to see. South Park finished that episode while the country was still counting votes. The result was barely dry on the screen, and the show already had a reading of it. That episode is one entry in a nearly 30-year relationship the show has had with the American presidency, a relationship that runs from George Washington to the man currently sitting in the Oval Office. And tonight we are going to walk through every single one of them. So get comfortable, settle in, turn the lights down, and if you have not subscribed to Papertown yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these long, deep dives. We will be here a while. Before we touch any of the sitting presidents that South Park has actually satirized while they were in office, it is worth remembering how the show treats American history at all, because that frame matters for every president who follows. The show has its own private library of dead presidents. They show up in fever dreams, in patriotic montages, in the marble corners of museum scenes, in cold opens that ape a History Channel documentary, in a Civil War flashback, or a Founding Fathers gag, or a school assembly. And the show treats them with a particular kind of flatness. There is no reverence, no special lighting, no swelling music. They are characters like everyone else in the town. They have the same construction paper mouths, the same flat color fills, the same two earnest voices. The show is interested in them not as historical figures, but as American symbols, which is a different thing, and the difference is the whole engine. The first of them, and the one the show returns to most often, is George Washington. Washington is the patron saint of American mythology, and South Park, which has been quietly arguing with American mythology since the late 1990s, cannot really do an essay on its presidents without starting there. He turns up in the episode known as I'm a Little Bit Country, which aired in April of 2003, near the start of the 7th season. The episode is doing several things at once, but its heart is a dream sequence. Cartman, having pretended to give himself a flashback to get out of homework, finds himself dropped into the Continental Congress, and he watches the Founding Fathers debate the question of independence from Britain in a way that is plainly a stand-in for the country's argument over the invasion of Iraq, which was happening on the news as the episode aired. Washington is there, he speaks, he votes. He is presented as a man who, in the show's reading, holds both views at once, that the country must be willing to go to war and that it must be willing to protest its own wars, and that these two impulses, far from canceling each other out, are what makes the country function. That is, of course, the show's interpretation, not anybody's actual historical view, and the episode is honest about that. It is a fable, not a documentary, but it gives Washington a job in the South Park universe, and the job is to be the voice that says the country is built on argument. Once you have that role assigned, every other president the show meets is measured, in some small way, against it. Washington's other appearances are quieter. He sits on the dollar bill, he stands on the wall behind classrooms. He is the bust in the corner of an office. In imagination land, where every fictional and mythological figure ever invented turns up, at some point the founders are part of the patriotic side of the imagination. The show keeps him close, not as a constant character, but as a reference point, a thing the writers can reach for when they need to remind you what the American story tells itself. The other founder who matters here, by accident of having been on the early American currency and by accident of having been a president, is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, in the I'm a Little Bit Country episode, is part of the same debate. He gets lines. The show presents the Founding Fathers as a deeply silly, deeply uncertain group of men who are figuring it out as they go, drinking, joking, and slowly arriving at an idea about how the country might be allowed to disagree with itself. This is interpretation, and the show is doing it on purpose. Jefferson, the historical figure, was a far more controversial man than the show's caricature of him allows, but the South Park caricature is doing a specific job. It is saying that the country was founded by a group of people who did not themselves know exactly what they were doing, and that this is somehow the point. John Adams is in the same room, and so is Benjamin Franklin, although Franklin was never president. The show treats them all as one bickering ensemble. It is interested in the act of founding, not in any particular founder. The Iraq War is the actual subject of the episode, and the founders are a device. By the time the dream is over and Cartman wakes up, the show has used them as it needed to use them. and they go back into the closet until the next time American mythology needs to argue with itself. Move forward a few decades from the founding, and you get to Abraham Lincoln, who is the second most often referenced president in the show, although the references are smaller and more scattered than the Washington appearances. Lincoln is on the penny, he is on the $5 bill, he is in the Mount Rushmore stock footage that the show occasionally cuts to when it wants a quick patriotic beat. He is a figure that the show treats with the same flatness as anyone else, a man with a beard and a hat who shows up when the writers need an iconic American to make a point. Lincoln does not get his own episode, but his shadow runs across several. The show is fascinated by political assassinations because political assassinations are exactly the kind of dark American myth that South Park loves to chew on, and Lincoln is the original. When the show goes looking for what it calls the deep American conspiracy, the assassinated presidents are part of the menu. Lincoln, by the show's logic, is one of the saints of that conspiracy, a man whose death changed everything and whose death gets reinterpreted every generation. Skipping forward, you pass through a long stretch of presidents who South Park essentially does not engage with. The 19th century after Lincoln is largely empty in the show's universe. Ulysses S. Grant is not a character. Theodore Roosevelt does not appear in any meaningful way that the archive records. Woodrow Wilson is absent. Calvin Coolidge is absent. The show is not a history program, and it is not interested in presidents who do not have a place in current American memory. South Park is a satire of the present, and it reaches into the past only when the past is alive in the present moment. The presidents who are alive in the present, in the way the show needs, are essentially a short list. Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Nixon, Reagan, and then the sitting presidents the show has actually existed alongside. Everyone else is a name on a list. Franklin Roosevelt is a quiet exception. He appears in the show's wider universe occasionally, mostly as a voice in a Second World War flashback or as a reference in a scene about the New Deal era, although these are rarer than you might expect. The show is more interested in the wartime period than in the man who led the country through it. South Park grew up after the end of the Cold War, and its writers were children of the Reagan and Bush years. Roosevelt is, for the show, a figure who belongs to an older America that exists only as a reference. The same is true of Truman, of Eisenhower, of the war years before the assassinations. They are off stage. When the show wants to do an American history episode, it tends to skip from the founding to the Civil War to the Cold War to the present, and the long middle stretch of presidents simply does not interest it. That brings us to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who is the next president that the show actually engages with. Kennedy is the figure that South Park reaches for when it wants to do a conspiracy episode, which is more often than you might think. The show has done several episodes about conspiracies, and the Kennedy assassination is the founding text of American conspiracy thinking, the original case that taught the country to mistrust its own official story. Kennedy himself does not appear as a character in any meaningful way. He is a memory, a moment of footage, a reference to a famous day in Dallas. But his death is one of the load-bearing beams of South Park's mythology of America. The show keeps coming back to the idea that something happened on that day in November of 1963 that the country never fully recovered from. And although the show treats this with its usual irony, it is also clearly a thing the writers find genuinely strange and worth chewing on. Lyndon Johnson, who became president on that day, is absent. There is no Johnson episode. There is no Johnson character. The show simply skips him, which is in itself a kind of statement. The show is interested in Kennedy as a martyr and in Nixon as a villain, but Johnson, who held the office between them and arguably changed it more than either, is treated by South Park as if he did not exist. This is again a matter of which presidents are alive in current memory. Johnson's place in the American story is more for historians than for satirists, and South Park is not a historian show. Richard Nixon is a different case. Nixon, in South Park, is a recurring specter. He appears in flashbacks, he appears in dream sequences, he turns up in cold opens that parody Cold War paranoia. He is the show's default visual shorthand for political corruption, the dark father of the conspiracy era. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spoken in interviews over the years about their love of the era of cynicism that Nixon ushered in, the era of films like All the President's Men and 3 Days of the Condor, the era when American film and television first started to assume that the government was lying. South Park is in some sense a child of that era, even though the writers themselves were too young to have voted through any of it. The Nixon aesthetic, the dark wood-paneled office, the recorded conversations, the man at the desk who knows he is being watched and keeps talking anyway, is part of the show's visual vocabulary. When South Park wants to draw a president as guilty, the model is Nixon, even when the actual president on screen is somebody else. Gerald Ford is essentially absent. Jimmy Carter is essentially absent, although there are scattered references over the years. The peanut farmer turned president is the kind of figure that does not quite fit South Park's interests. He is too earnest, too easily reduced to a single gag, and the gag has been done by everyone else. The show occasionally invokes the late 1970s in the way it invokes any decade, with disco music and bad fashion. But it does not do a Carter episode. Ronald Reagan is the president the show was born under in the sense that Trey Parker and Matt Stone came of age during the Reagan years. Reagan does not appear as a character in any major episode, but the Reagan era is everywhere in the show's furniture. The Cold War paranoia, the satellite anxiety, the nuclear dread, the religious revival, the rise of cable news, the early years of the culture war, all of these are baked into the South Park worldview from the very first episode. The show that aired in 1997 was the work of two men who had spent their teenage years in Reagan's America, and the Reagan era's particular flavor of patriotic optimism dressed over deep cynicism is, you could argue, the master tone of South Park itself. Reagan himself, though, gets the same treatment as Carter. He is a face in archive footage, a name in a flashback, a voice in a cold open about the 80s. The show is not interested in litigating his presidency directly. It is more interested in the country he left behind. George Herbert Walker Bush is the bridge between the Reagan era and the show's own era. He was in office when the original Christmas card animation that became South Park was being put together by Parker and Stone as young animators. He is the man who lost to Bill Clinton in the election of 1992, 4 years before the show actually arrived on television. The first Bush does not really appear in the show except as a reference point for the era. He is on the cover of an old-time magazine in a background shot. He is mentioned in a list. His son, when he later becomes president, will sometimes be talked about in relation to him. But the elder Bush is, in the South Park universe, a faded photograph. The Reagan and Bush era ends and the show begins, and what begins with it is the first sitting president that South Park ever shared the air with. Bill Clinton was the President of the United States when South Park premiered on Comedy Central in August of 1997. He had been re-elected the previous November. His second term was already underway. The Lewinsky story was about to break. The country was in a particular kind of late 1990s cultural mood that you can hear in the first few seasons of the show very clearly, a mood of cynicism dressed up as boredom. A sense that nothing terribly important was happening and that the news cycle was busy inventing crises to fill the gap. South Park in those early seasons is a show that takes that mood for granted. It assumes the audience is bored of the news. It assumes the audience already finds politics a bit ridiculous. It does not have to set up the joke because the country had already set it up. What is interesting about the Clinton era of South Park is how little Clinton himself appears in it. You would expect, given the timing, that the first few seasons of the show would be wall-to-wall Clinton jokes. They are not. Clinton is a name in the show, not really a character. He is referenced in dialogue, especially around the impeachment moment, but he does not stand in the center of an episode the way later presidents will. The writers at that time were more interested in everything around him. They were interested in cable news. They were interested in religion. They were interested in celebrity. They were interested in the kind of moral panics that the Clinton era kept producing. The panics over violent television and rap music and video games and Marilyn Manson and so on. Clinton, as a person, was almost too easy a target. Every other show on television was doing Clinton jokes. South Park, in its early seasons, mostly let the other shows have them. There is something fascinating in this. South Park's first major engagement with the presidency comes not really through Clinton at all, but through a cluster of episodes about war, about religion, about celebrity culture, that quietly establish the show's voice on power before any specific president steps in front of it. The first season has the famous Mr. Hanky Christmas special. The second season has the Chef Aid charity. The third season starts deepening the political satire, but it is still pointed mostly at culture rather than at the White House. The Clinton era of South Park is, if you watch it back now, weirdly apolitical compared to what comes later. It is closer to a savage suburban sitcom than to the national essay show that South Park will become. That said, Hillary Clinton does eventually become a recurring figure in the South Park universe, especially in the 21st century. She is referenced repeatedly through the Obama years and the Trump years. The show has a fairly consistent caricature of her, a woman in a pantsuit at a podium, and the caricature gets dropped into various scenes when the writers need to do a beat about establishment politics. The portrayal is not flattering, but the portrayal is rarely flattering of anybody in South Park. The show treats Hillary the way it treats most public figures, as a face it can deploy for a quick joke, never as a deeply drawn character. The earlier Bill Clinton, the man who was actually president when the show began, never gets even that level of attention. There is a moment in the 4th season, in the episode known as Quintuplets 2000, that gestures at the Clinton administration through its officials, although the appearance of the president himself is brief and largely incidental. The episode is mostly about a circus and a Romanian family, and Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General at the time. Janet Reno, in fact, gets more screen time in the early years of South Park than Bill Clinton ever does. She becomes a kind of recurring boogeyman in a couple of episodes, played for the same kind of cartoon menace that the show used to play with most authority figures. Reno's appearances are a strange artifact of the late 1990s, a reminder of how prominent the Justice Department was in that era's news. They are also, in a sideways way, the show's commentary on the Clinton administration. The administration shows up in the show through its officials, not through its president, which is its own kind of choice. If you are watching South Park's first 4 seasons looking for the show's portrait of Bill Clinton specifically, you will not really find one. What you will find is the show developing its voice, sharpening its tone, learning how to do a quick reaction to a news cycle, learning how to draw a politician at a podium and put words in their mouth without making them sound like a sketch. By the time the next president steps onto the stage, South Park has learned to do all of this almost in real time. And the next president, who will arrive under conditions nobody expected, becomes the first president that the show really, truly goes to war with. George Walker Bush became president in January of 2001. The show was in its 4th season at the time. The election that put him in office had been, by any standard, the strangest in modern American history, decided not on election night, but in the weeks of recounts that followed, and ultimately by the Supreme Court. South Park by then had developed a reaction speed, and the Bush years were the years in which the show really learned how to do an episode about the news while the news was still in the air. In the early Bush years, the show was actually not yet a fully political show. The 4th and 5th seasons of South Park are a strange transitional period, the show experimenting with longer arcs, with continuity, with the kind of darker material that would later define it. The episodes that aired in the months after the September 11th attacks are the moment at which the show shifts. South Park was not particularly political before that. It became political after. The reasons are partly biographical, partly cultural, partly accidental. Parker and Stone were in Los Angeles when the attacks happened. The show came back on the air a few weeks later, and the episode they aired, known as Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants, is the moment at which the show takes its first long look at the new American moment. It is also the moment at which the figure of the sitting president becomes important to it. George W. Bush is the first sitting president that South Park actually treats as a character. He appears in various forms in a number of episodes through the early 2000s. He is voiced, he has scenes, he gets lines. The show does not love him and does not hate him in the way the show does not love or hate anybody, but it engages with him, which is something it never did with Clinton. The Bush years are the years in which South Park grows up into the show that everyone now thinks of when they hear the title. The most famous Bush appearance is in an episode from the 10th season known as Mystery of the Urinal Deuce, which aired in October of 2006. The episode is about Stan trying to figure out who is responsible for an act of vandalism in the school bathroom, and the investigation balloons, in the way South Park investigations do, into a national conspiracy. Stan ends up in Washington in the White House, in a basement where the truth about the September 11th attacks is revealed to him. The reveal is layered and deliberately confusing. There are men in suits who tell him that the government did do it. There is then a further reveal that the men telling him this are themselves part of a deeper conspiracy, that the truth is that the government had nothing to do with it, and is engineering the conspiracy theories themselves in order to make the country fear them. The episode goes around in a circle and lands on the joke that the actual explanation is the simplest one, that bad men flew planes into buildings and that all the conspiracy theories are essentially the country's refusal to accept that fact. The president himself appears in the episode and is presented as exhausted by the whole business, a man who is in over his head but who knows more than he is letting on, a man who is sad, in a strange way, that the country cannot just believe what happened. This is the show's most considered take on Bush, and it is a fascinating one because it is much less hostile than people who do not watch the show tend to assume. South Park's Bush is not the cackling villain of liberal cable news. He is also not the hero of conservative talk radio. He is a man at a desk, tired, partly bewildered, partly cunning, who the show treats as a politician rather than as a monster. The reading is, again, interpretation, and other readings are available. But the show's Bush is recognizably the show's Bush, and the show keeps coming back to him. There are other Bush-era moments worth pulling out. The 4th episode of the 7th season, which aired in April of 2003, is the one called I'm a Little Bit Country, which we mentioned earlier in the context of the founders. The episode is, on its surface, about the Iraq War, and it is structured around a town debate over whether the United States should be invading Iraq at all. Cartman, having decided he does not want to do the homework assigned to him about the war, fakes a flashback to the Continental Congress in order to talk to the founding fathers about it. The dream sequence, as we said, is largely a way of letting the founders make the show's argument that the country has always been one half hawk and one half dove, and that this argument is the country itself. The Bush administration is everywhere in the episode without ever being named directly. The president is not on screen. He does not need to be. The whole town is having his argument for him. The 8th season has a couple of Bush-era touchstones as well. There is the episode known as The Passion of the Jew, which is about the Mel Gibson film rather than about Bush, but which is operating in the religious revival mood of the second Bush term. There is the episode known as Goobacks, which is about immigrants coming back in time from the future to take present-day jobs, and which is reading the immigration debate of the moment. And there is the episode known as Douche and Turd, which is about a school mascot election, and which has a famous monologue from Stan about the futility of all political choices, that every election is a choice between a giant douche and a turd sandwich. The episode aired in late 2004, just before the actual presidential election, and it has become, over the years, the South Park line about American politics. The line is, of course, the show's reading, not anybody's official position. The show is making an argument about the disenchantment of the modern voter, and it is making it through Stan's voice. But the line escaped the episode and became part of the culture's vocabulary for talking about elections. And it has come back into circulation in almost every election cycle since. The Bush years also gave the show its first sustained run of episodes about religion, which were partly a response to the rise of the religious right during the Bush administration. Trapped in the Closet, about Scientology, aired in November of 2005, and caused the show one of its largest controversies, although it was about a religion that Bush himself had nothing to do with. The episode is interesting in the Bush context because the religious revival that the second Bush term presided over made the entire question of what religion is and what religion is for into a national subject, and South Park was happy to argue with all sides of it. The show went after evangelical Christianity, after Mormonism, after Catholicism, after Scientology, after Islam, all in the same general window. The Bush era was, for South Park, a religious era as much as a political one, and the show was reading the country through that lens. There is also the long arc of Cartoon Wars, the pair of episodes that aired in April of 2006, which deal directly with the question of whether American media should be allowed to depict the Prophet Muhammad. The episodes were the show's response to the Danish cartoons controversy, and they include long scenes set inside the offices of the Family Guy production team. Scenes that turn into a meta-argument about satire and free speech and what cartoons are for. The Bush administration is in the background of all of this because the show is treating the war on terror as the background of the era, but the foreground is the show itself, arguing with the rest of American media about what it is allowed to say. Cartoon Wars is, in a real sense, the show's manifesto, and the manifesto is set in the Bush years for a reason. The whole question of the limits of speech became urgent during that administration in a way that it had not been before, and South Park took that question and made an episode of it. Bush appears in cameo or in passing in a number of other episodes, sometimes as a voice on a television in the background, sometimes as a figure at a podium, sometimes as a name in a list of presidents. The most consistent thing about the show's Bush portrayal is that the show does not seem terribly interested in attacking him personally. It is interested in attacking the era he inhabited. The wars, the surveillance, the religious revival, the rise of cable news, the long argument about what kind of country the United States was going to be after September 11th. Those are the show's subjects in the Bush years, and Bush himself is a man who happens to be standing at the center of them. When you watch the Bush era of South Park from a distance, it looks like the show's most productive and most varied stretch. The episodes are dense, the references are layered, the political content is more sustained than it was before or has been since. The show was, in a sense, made for that era. It was a show that had spent its first few seasons learning how to react quickly to the news, and the Bush years were a period of constant news. By the end of the Bush administration, in the back half of the 12th season, the show had developed the muscle it would need for the next president, who would arrive under conditions that the show had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. Barack Obama won the presidency on the 4th of November in 2008, and the next night, on the 5th, Comedy Central aired the 12th episode of the show's 12th season, an episode called About Last Night. The story of how that episode came to exist on the air the day after the election is, in a way, the story of the entire show. The episode could not have been written before the result was known because the result was the punchline. The writers, working with the animation team, had to prepare two versions of the episode, one for an Obama win and one for a McCain win, and then, on election night, they finished the version the country needed. The episode was on the air within 24 hours. The country was still hanging up its election night bunting. South Park had already published its take. The episode itself is a strange and lovingly made thing. The plot is, at first glance, a parody of the Ocean's 11 film, in which Obama and McCain and a team of operatives are revealed to have been planning, over the course of decades, a heist on the Smithsonian to steal the Hope Diamond. Obama is not, in this telling, a man who has just won a presidential election. He is a thief who has spent the better part of his career carefully constructing a public persona, a campaign, a movement, all so that on the night of the election, the country would be drunk and distracted, and the security around the diamond would be reduced. McCain is in on it. So is Sarah Palin. So is Michelle Obama. The entire campaign was, in the show's reading, a piece of theater for the benefit of the world's largest jewelry robbery. The episode is doing a number of things at once. On the most obvious level, it is a parody of the Ocean's films and of the genre of caper films generally, with the long monologues about timing and the elaborate gadgets and the staged double crosses. On a slightly deeper level, it is take on the idea that American politics is itself a piece of theater, that the people who run for office are not, in some essential way, what they appear to be. The show is reading the campaign as a story, and the story is interpretation, not fact. The actual Obama did not, of course, run for president in order to steal a diamond from the Smithsonian, and the show is not claiming that he did. The claim is metaphorical. The claim is that the show, watching the campaign from the outside, did not entirely believe in any of it, and that on the night of the result, when half the country was elated and the other half was crushed, the show wanted to suggest that maybe the elation and the crushing were both responses to a piece of stagecraft. What is striking about Last Night, watching it back now, is how warm it is. The show is not attacking Obama, it is not attacking McCain, it is not really attacking anyone. The episode has, for all its cynicism, an oddly affectionate tone. The Obama character is presented as a thoroughly competent professional thief, which is a kind of compliment. The McCain character is presented as a similarly competent thief, and the two of them work together with the kind of mutual respect that the actual campaign rarely showed. Sarah Palin, who in the actual campaign had been a polarizing figure, is presented as a brilliant British-accented operative who has been playing dumb the whole time, and the reveal of her real identity is treated as a kind of victory for her. The episode is, in its own backwards way, an act of generosity towards everyone involved. It is also a sustained joke about the country's tendency to project intelligence onto its political figures. The show is saying that of course these people are all very clever, of course they are all very competent, and of course none of them are quite what they appear to be on television. The episode is interesting also for what it does not do. It does not engage with the actual content of the Obama campaign, with the speeches, with the hope and change rhetoric, with the historic nature of the country having elected its first black president. None of that is in the episode. The show is doing something else, and what it is doing, you could argue, is being deliberately uncommitted. The other shows on television, that night and in the following weeks, we're going to be doing the historic moment angle, the inspirational moment angle, the great national reset angle. South Park instead did a caper movie. That choice tells you a lot about the show's posture in the Obama era. It was not going to be the show that celebrated the new president. It was also not going to be the show that attacked the new president. It was going to be the show that stood slightly to the side and made jokes about the theater of the whole thing. Through the Obama years, the show takes that posture and largely keeps it. There are scattered references to the president across the rest of the 12th season and through the 13th, 14th, and 15th seasons. Obama appears in the background of some episodes, on television screens, in news montages. He is mentioned in dialogue. He turns up in dream sequences. But he does not really become a character in the way Bush became a character. The Obama administration was a different kind of presidency, and South Park, which had spent the Bush years arguing with a particular kind of conservative cultural moment, did not have the same easy purchase on the Obama moment. The Obama administration was, for the show, less generative of weekly episode ideas. There were fewer easy targets, or at least fewer of the kind of easy targets the show preferred. What the show did instead during the Obama years was turn its attention to other things. The 14th season has the great long arc of Coon and Friends, about the kids forming a superhero team, which is the show's most sustained foray into long-form storytelling and which is much more interested in the world of comic books and movies than in the world of politics. That arc wins in its later episodes into a strange parody of the H.P. Lovecraft mythos, with the Dark Lord Cthulhu summoned into the affairs of small-town Colorado. The 15th season has the famous episode known as You're Getting Old, which is the existential breakdown episode, the one in which Stan starts hearing everything as if it were rubbish, the one in which Parker and Stone seemed, for a few weeks, to be considering ending the show. The 16th and 17th seasons keep the political content scattered and oblique. The 17th season also has the long arc about Black Friday, which is a Game of Thrones parody set inside a shopping mall the day after Thanksgiving. None of these are about the president. The show was clearly more interested in those years in the other parts of the culture. But the Obama presidency does run quietly through the show, and it shows up in particular in the way the show treats the political establishment in the back half of the run. The Obama era is the era in which South Park starts to treat all politicians as roughly the same kind of person, regardless of party. The show's argument throughout the Obama years is that the country has become exhausted by the partisan war, that the war itself is a kind of theater, that nothing very much depends on which side wins because the underlying machinery keeps running. This argument has its own problems. It is, again, the show's interpretation. Other readings of the era are available. But it is the show's posture, and it shapes how the show is going to handle the next election, which will turn out to be the election that breaks the show's posture entirely. The arc that produces South Park's most famous and most committed engagement with the presidency does not begin in the season 20 election year. It begins a year earlier in the back half of the 19th season, which aired through the autumn of 2015. The first episode of that season established that the town of South Park had been taken over by a new sort of cultural energy, the so-called politically correct movement, with a frat house of college-aged men moving in to police the town's speech. The arc is the show's first deeply continuous serialized storyline, with each episode picking up directly from the previous one, and it runs the full length of the season. Inside that arc, in the second episode, called Where My Country Gone, which aired in late September of 2015, the show introduces what will become its most consequential political joke. Mr. Garrison, the schoolteacher who has been a character since the very first episode of the show, announces that he is running for president. The Garrison campaign in Where My Country Gone is at first a parody of one particular candidate in the Republican primary that was happening at the time. The candidate in the actual world had launched his campaign earlier in the summer with an escalator descent in a building bearing his name, and with a now famous and now widely condemned speech about Mexican immigration. The show, watching that campaign, gave Mr. Garrison the same beats. Garrison decides that the problem in South Park is the influx of Canadians, who in the show's universe are the stand-in for Mexican immigrants in the joke. He gives speeches in which he says that he is going to take care of the immigration problem in language so crude and so violent that the show is plainly making a point about the rhetoric of the actual campaign. The crowd at his rallies cheers. The other characters in the show, including the kids, are alarmed by how popular this is. The episode ends with Garrison having traveled to Canada and discovering that Canada itself, as a country, has been overtaken by its own version of the same demagogue, a man who promised the same things and got elected. The episode is doing several things at once, and they are worth pulling apart. On its surface, it is a sharp satire of the moment, a piece of immediate reaction television in the South Park tradition. On a slightly deeper level, it is an essay about how demagogues actually work, how they exploit the country's frustrations, how the moderate voices fail to take them seriously until it is too late. On the deepest level, it is something else entirely, and the something else is the part of the joke that took the next year to fully reveal itself. The deepest level of the joke is that South Park, having watched the actual campaign for several months, did not believe that this candidate would win. The Garrison plotline was constructed in the original autumn of 2015 as a parody of a campaign that the show, like most of the political class at the time, expected to lose. The joke was supposed to be that a clearly unsuitable man would run a campaign that exposed the country's worst impulses and then would lose, and that the country would have to live with the embarrassment of having taken him seriously for as long as it did. The Garrison arc plays out across the rest of the 19th season. Garrison rises in the polls. Other Republican candidates drop out. The show finds increasingly inventive ways to do its parody, with Garrison's running mate emerging as Caitlyn Jenner in a particularly pointed and divisive joke. Garrison gives speeches. Garrison appears on television. The town debates him. By the end of the 19th season, in the finale, which aired in early December of 2015, the arc has wound itself into a complicated knot involving advertising and propaganda and the rise of the so-called sponsored content phenomenon. And Garrison's campaign is one strand in a larger argument the show is making about how American information itself has broken down. The finale leaves things on a deliberately unresolved note, with the town in a kind of suspended chaos. The implication is that the country is going to have to live with this for a while, and that the show is going to have to decide in the next season how to keep going. The 20th season of South Park, which began airing in September of 2016, is the season that the show has, in interviews since, more or less openly described as the season that did not work. It was supposed to be the first fully serialized season of the show, with every episode building on the previous one across a single year-long story. The story was going to be the story of the election. The election, as everyone expected at the time, was going to be a Hillary Clinton victory, and the show had constructed its arc around that expected outcome. The first episode of Season 20, called Members Only, aired in mid-September of 2016. It picks up the Garrison plotline from the previous season. Garrison is still the Republican nominee. He is still campaigning. He is still drawing crowds. He is, however, increasingly aware that he never actually wanted to win. The show's reading at that moment was that the real-life candidate was running a vanity campaign, and the show built into the Garrison character the same instinct. Garrison, in the early episodes of the 20th season, is shown trying to lose, trying to sabotage himself, trying to give speeches so offensive and so absurd that nobody could possibly vote for him. The country, the show suggests, is going to vote for him anyway. The crowds keep showing up. The other candidates keep failing to land a punch. Garrison's running mate, Caitlyn Jenner, keeps appearing as a kind of comic foil. The other plotline running through the early episodes of Season 20 is the troll plotline, which is the show's argument about the new architecture of the internet and about how the comment culture of the country had become an engine of cruelty. Kyle's father is revealed to be the most prolific troll in the country, a man who has spent his evenings systematically destroying the lives of people he has never met. The plotline runs alongside the election plotline, and the two are clearly meant to be talking to each other. The country the show is arguing has become a country of trolls, and the candidates that are succeeding in the election are themselves trolls. The Garrison campaign and the trolling epidemic are, in the show's reading, the same phenomenon. This arc, structured as it was around an expected Clinton victory, was halfway through its run on the night of the actual election. The 8th of November in 2016 was a Tuesday. The show, like every other show on television, expected a Clinton win. The episode that was supposed to air the next night, the night of the 9th, had been written and animated to reflect that outcome. When the actual result came in the small hours of the night, the show was caught in exactly the same position it had been in 8 years earlier, only with the opposite expectation. The writers had to throw out what they had made. They had to remake the episode in less than a day. The episode that ended up airing on the 9th, called Oh Geez, is a strange and slightly ragged piece of television, visibly stitched together in the hours after the election, with the show's characters reacting in real time to a result they had not quite been able to imagine. Oh Geez is one of the strangest episodes of South Park because it is an episode that is publicly admitting it does not know what to do. The town wakes up the morning after the election to discover that Garrison has won. The reactions in the episode are a kind of collective bewilderment. There is no triumphalism. There is no celebration. There is no rage exactly. There is just a sense of having been wrong, having been blindsided, having to recalibrate. The show, in real time, was working through the same question the rest of the country was working through, which was how to make sense of a result that almost nobody had predicted. The rest of season 20 is, in a way, the show trying to figure out what its arc had become. The plotlines that had been set up before the election, particularly the troll plotline and the Garrison plotline, had been designed around a Clinton victory, and now they had to be redirected. The redirection is visible in the final episodes of the season, which become darker and more elliptical, and which end without the resolution that the season had been promising. The show, at the end of the season, was clearly tired. Parker and Stone, in interviews shortly afterwards, said as much. They said that they had built a season around a particular kind of reaction television, and that the reaction television model had stopped working when the news cycle started moving too fast for them to keep up. From the 21st season onwards, they moved away from full season arcs. They moved back partly toward the standalone episode format that had defined the show in its earlier years. The election had broken something in the way the show approached politics, and the show was honest about it. The Garrison character continued to be the South Park version of the new president through the 21st and 22nd and 23rd seasons. He is in the Oval Office, he gives speeches, he fires people, he has phone calls. The Garrison presidency is the show's running gag through the first Trump administration, although it is a strange and uneven gag, because the show is no longer trying to do a sustained satire. Garrison is in the background of episodes. He pops up, he is referenced. The show is not, in those years, doing a weekly political essay on the administration. It is doing what it did during the Obama years, which is to say it is mostly looking elsewhere. What the show does do during the first Trump administration is run several long arcs that are quietly about the era without being directly about the president. The 21st season has the long arc about advertising and about the national anthem, about white supremacy. The 22nd season has the long arc about school shootings, the one in which the kids treat the shootings as a kind of normalized background noise. The 23rd season has the arc about the impact of China on American media, in particular the famous episode called Banned in China, which aired in October of 2019 and which led, as the show had openly invited it to South Park itself being banned in mainland China for a stretch. None of these arcs are about the president directly, but all of them are about the country he was the head of state of. The show in the first Trump era was doing exactly what it had done in the Bush era. It was satirizing the country, not the man. There is one strand of the Garrison era that is worth lingering on because it is the show's clearest political statement of the period. Across the back half of the 22nd season and into the 23rd, the Garrison character starts to look more and more tired, more and more bewildered, more and more the way the show drew Bush in his late period. The show is signaling, without ever quite saying it, that the man in the office has worn down to a shell. The pattern is familiar. The first term Bush in early episodes was drawn as a kind of frat boy cowboy. By the late episodes, in the Mystery of the Urinal Deuce era, he was drawn as exhausted and resigned. The show does the same thing to Garrison. Whatever you think of the politics of it, it is the show's recurring gesture. The presidency in South Park exhausts the man who holds it. The role consumes the human inside it. The show has been making that argument for as long as it has had presidents on screen. When the first Trump administration ended in January of 2021, South Park was in an unusual position with regard to the country's politics. The show had spent the previous several years quietly retreating from the kind of weekly partisan satire that had defined the Garrison era. The pandemic had hit. The show had moved to a different kind of episode entirely, the so-called specials, hour-long pieces that aired on Paramount Plus rather than on Comedy Central as part of a regular season. The first of these, the pandemic special, aired in September of 2020, while the actual pandemic was still in its first year, and the second, the South Park U vaccination special, aired in March of 2021, in the early months of the new administration. These specials are not really about the president. They're about the broader country, about lockdowns and masks and vaccines, and the strange new ways in which people had started living, and the political content in them is muted. There is no Biden character at the center of them. The man at the top of the country during the pandemic was, in the South Park universe, a kind of background detail. The second of those specials, the vaccination special, did include a glancing reference to the new president. By most accounts, a defaced photograph pinned to a conspiracy theorist's bulletin board rather than any speaking role. The show was clearly not in the mood to start a new sustained political run on the new administration. There were reasons for this. The country, in the early months of 2021, was visibly exhausted. The events of the previous January, which the show acknowledged only obliquely, had been so shocking that even the most committed satirists found themselves uncertain about how to keep doing satire. South Park, in interviews and in the show itself, signaled that it was going to give the moment some distance. A fully drawn Biden character never really arrived. The 25th season opened with the episode called Pajama Day, which aired in early 2022, and which, in classic South Park style, was only ostensibly about the president at all. The main plot was about the kids losing their right to wear pajamas to school after one of them breaks the rules of the day, and the episode was largely a parable about civic responsibility and about how individual misbehavior gets punished collectively. The new president flickered at the edge of the frame in the 25th season and the 26th, mentioned in dialogue present on a screen in the background, glimpsed in a one-beat cameo, but he was never built into the sustained on-screen character that Bush or Garrison had become. The show is doing, with Biden, what it has done with many presidents whose presidencies it cannot quite get a grip on. It is reading him as a function of the office, not as a discrete personality, and even then, mostly from a distance. What is interesting about the Biden era of South Park is how little of it there is. The 25th season has a handful of glancing references. The 26th season, which aired in early 2023, has a similarly light touch. The 27th season was delayed because of the long pause that the show took during the height of the streaming wars. And when it returned, the president had changed again. So the entire Biden administration in South Park is essentially covered by 3 short seasons of relatively standalone episodes, plus a few specials that touched on the era in oblique ways. There is no Biden arc, there is no sustained Biden character. The Biden years in the show are the quietest stretch of presidential satire the show has done in 20 years. There are several theories about why this is, all of which are interpretation rather than fact. One reading is that the show, having burned its fingers on the Garrison arc, and having decided that real-time political satire was not really sustainable anymore, simply chose not to do it. Another reading is that the Biden administration, like the Obama administration in its second term, was less generative of the kind of weekly culture war ephemera that South Park has historically thrived on. A third reading, which Parker and Stone have sometimes implied in interviews, is that the country had become so polarized that the show could no longer make a Biden joke without being claimed by one side or the other, and that the show preferred to step back rather than be conscripted into a political camp. Whichever reading you find most convincing, the result is the same. The Biden era of South Park is a quieter, more reflective, more elliptical period, and the show during those years did some of its strangest and most experimental work. The pandemic specials are part of that experiment. The streaming era specials are also part of it. The episode called Post-COVID, which aired in late 2021, is an hour-long piece that imagines the show's main characters all grown up and reunited as adults, with the world of South Park transformed by the pandemic. The episode is doing something the show has rarely done, which is to look forward in time and ask what kind of country the kids of South Park will be inhabiting when they are 40. The political content of the episode is light. The Biden administration is not really mentioned, but the episode is, in a sideways way, the show's commentary on the era it was airing in. The country that the grown-up characters inhabit is a country that is recognizably exhausted by everything that has happened over the previous 20 years, and the exhaustion is the show's most consistent reading of the Biden moment. The other specials of the streaming era continue in this register. The streaming war specials, which aired in mid-2022, are mostly about the absurdity of the new entertainment economy, and the political content in them is incidental. The Joining the Panderverse special, which aired in late 2023, is about race and casting, and the way Hollywood handles diversity, and it is more directly political, but it is not really about the president. The End of Obesity special from the spring of 2024 is about the rise of new weight loss drugs and about the country's relationship with food. And again, the president is barely present. Each of these specials is doing political work in the South Park sense, but the politics is cultural rather than electoral. The president himself is at the edge of the frame. What this means is that by the time the next presidential election came around in the autumn of 2024, The show was in a particular kind of posture. It had spent 4 years stepping back from the sustained electoral satire that had defined the Garrison era. It had been doing cultural episodes instead. It had been doing specials. The country, meanwhile, had been doing what it had been doing throughout the post-2016 period, which is to say living through a very loud and very anxious political news cycle. The election of 2024 returned the previous president to office, and the show had to decide again what kind of relationship it was going to have with a sitting president. The answer in the 27th season has been a much more direct one than the show has used before. Mr. Garrison, the character that had carried the show's Trump joke from the autumn of 2015 through the first Trump administration, is essentially absent from the new arc. The show in the 27th season has stopped using a fictional stand-in. It has put the actual president on the screen. The decision is a significant departure from the show's usual practice. South Park has, throughout its run, generally preferred to satirize public figures by means of caricatured cartoon characters, rather than by means of direct visual representation. The show has used direct representation before, of course. Saddam Hussein is a recurring direct character. Various celebrities have been drawn as themselves over the years. Hillary Clinton has been drawn as herself in some scenes. But the show's preferred method has been to use a stand-in, and Garrison was the most successful version of that method. In the 27th season, the show set Garrison aside and used the man himself. The first episode of the 27th season, called Sermon on the Mount, aired on the 23rd of July in 2025. It was the show's first new episode after a long pause occasioned by the streaming licensing negotiations and by the writers' uncertainty about how to return to the air in the new political moment. The episode was, from its first frames, plainly a statement. The President of the United States was a character in it. He was drawn with the same flat construction paper aesthetic as everyone else in the town. But his face was the actual face of the president, not a Garrison stand-in. The episode placed him in a series of scenes that were, by any reading, sharply critical. There was a scene set in the White House. There was a scene involving him in bed with Satan, which was a deliberate echo of an earlier South Park joke that had been done with Saddam Hussein during the show's first season. The episode was treating the new administration as the show had treated the second Bush administration in its earliest days, which is to say with full energy, full attention, and no fig leaf. The response from the White House was almost immediate. A statement was issued the next day criticizing the show. The episode became, within a few days, one of the most discussed pieces of American television of the year. The show, which had spent 4 years quietly stepping away from direct presidential satire, was suddenly back at the center of the conversation. The fact that the episode aired on Comedy Central, which is owned by the same corporate parent that had recently signed a large licensing deal for the streaming rights to the show, added a layer of media business intrigue to the moment that had not been there for any previous South Park presidential controversy. The trade press wrote about the show as if it were a piece of corporate strategy. The political press wrote about it as if it were a partisan statement. Parker and Stone, in the few interviews they did around the time, treated it the way they had treated previous controversies, which is to say as if the controversy itself was a part of the joke they were telling. The second episode of the 27th season, called Gotta Nut, aired in early August of 2025 and continued the direct approach. The third episode continued it again. The show had clearly decided that this time it was going to do the satire in the traditional, head-on, weekly reaction style that it had used in the early Bush years. The country was, by then, well into the new administration's first year, and the show was treating each week's news as material. The episodes were drawing the president directly. They were involving members of the cabinet. They were doing storylines that engaged with the administration's specific policies and specific statements. The Garrison era had ended in the show's prehistory, even though the character technically still exists. The new era was a direct satire era, the most sustained the show had done since the Bush administration in its first run. The 27th season has continued through the autumn of 2025 and into the winter, with subsequent episodes building on the season's central plotline. The show in this season has done more direct presidential content per episode than it has done in any season since the 10th, perhaps even more than the 10th, which had the mystery of the urinal deuce and a handful of other Bush episodes. The intensity of the season has been remarkable. Critics have written about it as a return to form. Detractors have written about it as a partisan turn. The show itself, in the way it tells the story, has presented it as simply the right reaction to the moment. The argument inside the show is that the country has become, again, the kind of country that requires direct satire, and that the indirect method that the show preferred for so long is no longer sufficient to the moment. What is striking about the 27th season, watching it as it has been airing, is how much it echoes the earliest political seasons of the show. The pacing is similar, the tone is similar, the sense of the episodes being written in real time, in reaction to the news of the previous week, is similar. The show has gone back to being a weekly reaction program the way it was during the second Bush administration. The visual style is, of course, more polished than it was in 2003, and the production schedule is presumably less terrifying than it was in the early days when the show was made on a 6-day cycle. But the underlying instinct is the same. The show is reacting in real time to a president it has plenty of material on. The material is the era. The era is the show's subject. The president is the figure at the center of the era. There is one further thing worth saying about the second Trump era of South Park, and it is that the show, in choosing to drop the Garrison stand in and use direct representation, made a decision about what its satire is for. For a decade, from 2015 through to 2024, the show had hedged its bets. It had been able to do its Trump satire while keeping a layer of cartoon distance between the satire and the man. Garrison was Garrison. Garrison was also Trump. The two were and were not the same. The hedge allowed the show to engage with the era while preserving its plausible deniability about who exactly it was making fun of. When the show dropped the hedge in the 27th season, it was making a statement about its own confidence. The show no longer needed the cover. The show was going to put the man on the screen, and the controversies be damned. This is, in its own way, the most committed political move that South Park has made in its entire run. And it is the move that brings us up to the moment we are watching from now. If you step back from the chronology and look at South Park's relationship with the American presidency as a single arc that runs from 1997 to the present, several patterns become visible that are easy to miss when you are looking at one administration at a time. The first pattern is that the show has had two distinct modes of presidential satire, the indirect mode and the direct mode, and that it has alternated between them depending on the era. The Clinton era is the indirect mode, with Janet Reno standing in for the administration more often than Clinton himself. The Bush era is the direct mode, with Bush appearing as a character. The Obama era is largely indirect, with Obama appearing only occasionally and with the show preferring to engage with the broader culture. The first Trump era is again indirect, with Garrison standing in. The Biden era is so indirect as to be almost absent. The second Trump era is direct again, with the man on the screen. The show, in other words, has not had a single posture on the presidency. It has had a series of postures calibrated to the moment. The second pattern is that the show's direct presidential portraits, when they happen, tend to follow a particular arc within the administration. The first portrait is, almost always, sharp and energetic. The middle portraits become more elliptical, more incidental, more part of the wider weekly fabric of the show. The late portraits, in the back half of an administration, tend to draw the president as exhausted, as wearing down, as worn out by the office. This is the pattern that runs from Bush through to Garrison. It is, again, interpretation. The show has not said in interviews that it is doing this on purpose, but the pattern is there in the episodes, and once you have noticed it, you can see it across the run. The third pattern is that the show consistently treats the presidency as a role rather than as a person. It is not interested in psychologizing any individual president. It does not give you a deep portrait of any of them as a human being. The Bush and Mystery of the Urinal Deuce is not Bush the man, it is the office of the presidency in a Bush-shaped suit. The Garrison president in season 21 is not the actual president as a human being. It is the office in a Garrison-shaped suit. The show is doing something specific with this. It is arguing that the office is bigger than the people who occupy it, and that the people who occupy it become, in some inevitable way, defined by the office rather than the other way around. This is, again, the show's reading. It is not the only reading available, but it is the show's, and it is consistent across decades. The fourth pattern is that the show treats the country as the actual subject of its satire, and the president as the most useful symbol of the country. This is the most consistent thing about the run, and it is what makes the show's political content age relatively well. If the show were really doing satire of individual presidents, the episodes would feel locked to their moment. Most of them do not. The Bush-era episodes still read, partly because they are not really about Bush, they are about the country that elected Bush. The Garrison episodes still read because they are not really about Trump, they are about the country that produced Trump. The Obama episodes are quieter in part because the show was using Obama as a symbol of a country in a quieter mood. The Biden episodes are quieter again because the show was using Biden, when it used him at all, as a symbol of a country in a kind of recovery period. The presidents are, in the show's logic, masks worn by the country, and the country is what the show is actually drawing. Let us go back for a stretch and look more closely at some of the individual presidential episodes that we have only glanced at so far, because the closer you look at the details, the more the show's argument starts to come into focus. The Bush years deserve a longer second visit because they are the show's most consistent run of weekly presidential content, and because the choices the show made during those years set the template for everything that came after. The Bush administration began in January of 2001, just before the start of the show's 5th season. The 5th season is the one with the famous Scott Tenorman Must Die episode, which is the apotheosis of the show's early dark humor. And it is also the season that was on the air on the 11th of September of 2001. The show went off the air for a few weeks after the attacks, and when it returned to a different country. The episode that aired in November of 2001, called Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants, is a strange and revealing piece of television. The kids are taken on a class trip and end up by a series of cartoon coincidences in Afghanistan. They meet Osama bin Laden, who is presented as a Looney Tunes-style figure of fun, a man with bombs hidden in his clothes, and a Yosemite Sam-style sneer on his face. The episode treats the new global situation as an old form of cartoon enemy, and it does so very deliberately. It is, in a strange way, an act of comfort. The country is being told that the new threat is, on some level, the same old kind of bad guy that the country has been beating in cartoons for 60 years. In that same episode, Bush is present, he is on the radio, he is on the television, he is on the phone. He is not yet quite a developed character, but he is on the screen of the show in the way that previous presidents had not been. The episode is the moment at which Bush becomes a part of the show's furniture. From that point on, through the rest of the 5th season and into the 6th, Bush appears as a recurring presence. The show is not yet doing weekly satire of him, but it is now able to draw him, voice him, write him into scenes. The 6th season is where this starts to deepen. The 6th season aired in 2002, the year between the Afghanistan invasion and the Iraq invasion, and the show was paying close attention to the country's mood. The episodes are denser than they were in the early seasons, the satire is sharper, the political content is more sustained. The famous Red Hot Catholic Love episode from the 6th season, which is largely about the Catholic Church scandals, is also, in a sideways way, about the country's relationship with institutions in the post-9/11 moment. The show is reading the country, and the country is, in 2002, a country that has stopped trusting its institutions. The Bush administration is the institution that the country had to either trust or not trust, and the show is reading that question in nearly every episode. The 7th season, in 2003, is the season of I'm a Little Bit Country and of the early Iraq War response. The 8th season, in 2004, is the season of Douche and Turd and of the election that returned Bush to office for his 2nd term. Those episodes have been mentioned, but the Douche and Turd episode deserves a longer look because it is the show's clearest statement of its electoral posture. The episode aired in October of 2004, just before the actual election, and it is about Stan being forced to vote on the new mascot for South Park Elementary, with the choices being a giant douche or a turd sandwich. Stan does not want to vote. He thinks both choices are bad. The town pressures him into voting. He resists. He is shunned. The whole episode is a parable about voting in a system where neither option appeals to you. The episode does not, in the end, recommend not voting. The closing scene, in fact, makes the argument that voting matters even when you do not believe in your choices, although the argument is delivered in such a deliberately deflated way that you can read the episode either as a defense of voting or as a quiet attack on it. The line, the one about the giant douche and the turd sandwich, has had a strange afterlife in American political conversation. It has been quoted in every election cycle since. It has been used by people on all sides of the political argument to characterize their opponents and to defend their own choices. The line, in some real sense, escaped the show and entered the language. South Park does this occasionally. The line is the show's gift to political discourse, and the gift has been complicated because the line has been used in ways the show probably did not intend. But it is the show's contribution, and you can hear its echoes in every election that has happened since. The 9th season, in 2005, is a transitional season. The Bush administration was in its second term. The country was deep into the Iraq War. The Hurricane Katrina disaster happened during the production of the season, and the show responded with the episode called 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow, which is a parody of the climate disaster genre and which uses the New Orleans situation as its backdrop. The episode is not really about Bush, but it is about the administration's response to the disaster, and the satire is sharp. The episode is one of the show's more pointed pieces of weekly reaction television. And it is from this kind of episode that the show built the muscle that would later allow it to do the Garrison arc. The 10th season, in 2006, is the season of the Mystery of the Urinal Deuce episode, which we have discussed. It is also the season of Cartoon Wars, which we have discussed. It is the most politically engaged season of the show's first decade. The 11th season, in 2007, has Imagination Land, the famous 3-part epic. And although Imagination Land is largely about fictional characters rather than about the president, the show finds room in it for a long sequence in which the government is shown as comically inept, with the president on the phone and various agencies failing to coordinate. The Bush administration is by the 11th season drawn as something approaching a tragic figure. The early Bush of the 5th season was a swaggering cowboy. The late Bush of the 11th season is a man at a desk who is not quite in control of his own administration, and the show is reading the moment that way. The 12th season, in 2008, is the season of About Last Night and of the Obama election. The season is full of episodes that are quietly transitional, that are looking forward to the country that is coming. The Bush administration is winding down. The country is choosing what comes next. The show, in the late episodes of the 12th season, is in a kind of waiting room mood. About Last Night is, in a way, the show closing the door on the Bush era. The new president walks into the show on the day after the election, and the Bush era is finally over. If you watch the Bush years of South Park as a single arc, what you see is the show learning how to do sustained political satire. It started not knowing how. It learned, episode by episode, over 8 years. By the end of the Bush years, the show was the most politically literate animated comedy in American television. It had figured out how to do weekly reaction. It had figured out how to do the long arc. It had figured out how to draw a sitting president as a character. It had figured out how to use stand-in characters as needed, and when not to use them. The skills that the show would later apply to the Garrison era were all developed in the Bush years. The Bush era was, in a real sense, the show's apprenticeship as a political satire. Everything that came afterwards is a variation on what the show learned during those 8 years. Now let us look more closely at the Obama era, which we have called quieter and less generative because the closer you look at it, the more interesting some of the individual episodes turn out to be. The Obama era of South Park runs from the 13th season through to the 20th, a span of 8 years, exactly matching the actual administration. That is many production runs of episodes, several specials, and a long stretch of the show's middle period. There is more presidential content in those years than the general impression suggests, even if none of it accumulated into a sustained arc. The 13th season, in 2009, has the episode called Margaritaville, which is about the economic crisis that was reaching its peak in the early months of the new administration. The episode is, in a sideways way, about the way the country was choosing to interpret the crisis, with Stan's father going through a religious-style conversion in response to the financial troubles, and the town developing an entire pseudo-religion around the bad economy. The Obama administration is in the background of the episode mentioned in passing on the news. The show is not engaging with the new president directly, it is engaging with the country that he had just inherited. The 14th season, in 2010, is the Coon and Friends season that we mentioned. It also has the famous 2-part episode called 200 and 201, which is the show's most controversial pair of episodes about religious depiction, and which had a difficult production history that ended with the show's audio being partially censored by the network. The episodes are not about Obama, but they are about the country's broader struggle with what is permitted in cultural representation, and that struggle is, in the show's reading, very much a feature of the Obama era. The country was, in the show's view, becoming increasingly polarized about what could and could not be said, and the show was reading that polarization through religious depiction, through the politically correct movement that would later be more directly satirized. and through 100 other small details. The 15th season in 2011 has the You're Getting Old episode that we mentioned, and the existential crisis that the show's creators went through during that period is, in some sense, a feature of the Obama era in microcosm. The show was unsure what its purpose was. The country was unsure what its purpose was. The 15th season is also the season of the Human Centipede episode, which is the famous parody of Apple's terms of service and of the broader culture of consumer surrender. The episode is, again, not about Obama, but it is about the country he was the head of, and about the corporate culture that was rising during his administration. The show was reading the era through technology, through consumer behavior, through the slow erosion of attention. The 16th season in 2012 contains the famous episode called Going Native, which is set partly in Hawaii and which has been read by some viewers as a sideways reference to the new president's birthplace and to the so-called birther controversy. The reading is, again, interpretation rather than confirmed canon. The episode is not explicitly about the president, but it is set in the place that was at the center of the birther argument, and the timing is suggestive. The show was, during the 2012 election year, doing what it had not really done before, which is to engage with the country's politics through misdirection. The episodes of that season are full of small political beats that never quite become political episodes. The pattern is consistent across the second Obama term. The 17th season in 2013 has the Black Friday arc, which is the Game of Thrones parody. It also has the famous episode called Let Go, Let Gov, which is about the National Security Agency surveillance revelations that had been in the news that summer. The episode is one of the show's most directly political pieces of the Obama era, and it is sharply critical of the surveillance state that the administration was, fairly or unfairly, presiding over. The Obama administration is treated in that episode as a continuation of the Bush administration in this particular respect. The show is making the argument that the surveillance question is not a partisan question, and that the country has built a machinery for watching itself that operates regardless of which party is in the White House. The episode is the show's most direct Obama-era political statement, even though Obama himself is not really in it. The 18th season in 2014 is the season in which the show experimented with serialization for the first time, with each episode picking up loose threads from the previous one. The season is mostly about technology and gaming, but it has political content in scattered moments. The 19th season in 2015 is the PC arc and the start of the Garrison campaign, which we have discussed at length. If you add up the Obama era of South Park, what you have is a long stretch of the show in a kind of contemplative mode. The show was not, in those years, doing the weekly reaction television it had done in the Bush years. It was doing something else, something quieter, something more interior. The show was, you could argue, growing up. It was a show in its second decade, made by men in their 40s, looking at a country that had become quieter than the country of the Bush years, and that was using its quiet in unexpected ways. The Obama era is the show's middle period, and it has aged well, even if it was less obviously eventful at the time. The Garrison era we have covered. Let us turn now to a question that the show has been asking in its own way for its entire run, and which becomes urgent in the second Trump era. That question is what satire is for in a country where the things being satirized are already satirizing themselves. South Park has been wrestling with this question for 30 years. It is the question that animated the show's early decisions to draw celebrities exactly as they appear in real life. It is the question that drove the Cartoon Wars episodes. It is the question that the Garrison arc forced the show to confront in earnest, when the actual political moment turned out to be more absurd than any cartoon version of it could possibly be. And it is the question that, in the 27th season, the show has tried to answer by going back to its earliest method, which is to say by putting the man directly on the screen and just drawing what he does. The argument the show seems to be making across all of this is that satire works by amplification, not by invention. The South Park method has always been to take a real thing and to make it slightly larger, slightly louder, slightly more absurd, until the audience can see the shape of it clearly. The trick stops working when the real thing is already larger and louder and more absurd than any amplification could make it. The Garrison era was the show's response to one version of this problem. The direct portrayal in the 27th season is the show's response to a different version of it. Neither response is perfect, neither response is the obvious choice, but both are recognizably the show's, and both are the show trying to keep making satire in conditions that have made satire harder. The Founding Fathers, we said, are a kind of measuring stick for the rest of the show's presidents. Let us go back to them for a moment because they have one more thing to teach us about how the show thinks. In the I'm a Little Bit Country episode, the founders are presented as a group of men who, in the show's invention, deliberately built into the country the structural argument that the country would have for the rest of its life. The country, in the founders' supposed view, would always be a country at war with itself over the question of how to use its power. The founders in the show anticipate this. They build the country's machinery around it. The endless argument between the hawks and the doves, between the country and the protesters, between the patriot and the dissenter, was, in the show's fable, the founders' deliberate gift. This is again the show's reading, not anybody's historical account. The actual Founding Fathers, as actual historical people, did not have a single view about anything, and the show is plainly aware of that. But the show's fable is doing a particular kind of work. It is telling the country a story about itself in which the country's argument is the country, in which to be American is to be inside an argument that nobody is ever going to win. This is, in the show's logic, why the country can survive its presidents. Each president becomes one voice in the argument. The argument continues. The country survives. The president, in the long view, is a temporary figure inside a permanent argument. You can see this idea running across every presidential episode the show has done. The Bush of Mystery of the Urinal Deuce is a temporary figure inside the permanent argument. The Obama of About Last Night is a temporary figure inside the permanent argument. The Garrison of Season 20 is a temporary figure inside the permanent argument. The Biden the show barely drew is a temporary figure inside the permanent argument. The show treats each of them with the same kind of resigned amusement, the same kind of practical acceptance, the same kind of long view. They are not, in the show's logic, the country. They are men who, for a stretch, are wearing the country's hat. This is one of the things that has made the show's political content survive the test of time. The episodes are not really partisan, they are about the country, and the country is more durable than any of its politicians. The episodes about a particular president are also about every president, because the show is using each one as an example of the same underlying argument. The episodes about Bush are also secretly about Obama. The episodes about Obama are also secretly about Trump. The episodes about Trump are also secretly about whoever comes next. The show is doing the same essay each time with different examples, and the essay is about the country rather than about the example. There is a strange and almost forgotten character that the show has used at intervals across its presidential satire, and that character is Saddam Hussein. The figure of Saddam, drawn in the show's particular cartoon style, has been a recurring part of the South Park universe almost from the beginning. He first appeared, as you may remember, in the show's first season, when he was depicted as the lover of Satan in the South Park version of Hell. The joke was, even at the time, deliberately provocative, and the show used the Saddam character for several years as a kind of stock comic villain. He returned in the South Park feature film, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, which was released in cinemas in 1999, and in which he played a substantial role. He returned again in subsequent episodes after the Iraq War, including a famous appearance in It's Christmas in Canada, the 7th season finale that aired in December of 2003, in which he was revealed as the secret puppet master behind the country's troubles. The reason Saddam matters in a discussion of South Park's presidential satire is that he is the show's most consistent example of how the show uses a real-world figure as a recurring character. The Saddam method, the technique of drawing an actual person in the show's actual visual style and keeping them around as a member of the recurring cast, is the technique that the show eventually applied to the actual presidents in the 27th season. The argument for the Saddam method is that it makes the satire visceral, that the audience cannot pretend the show is making fun of somebody else. The argument against it is that it can come across as cruel, that it reduces a complicated political situation to a personal caricature. The show has, over the years, been comfortable with both of these criticisms. It has continued to use the method when it has wanted to. The Saddam character is interesting also because he is one of the very few recurring South Park characters who is based on a real political figure. Most of the show's recurring characters are pure invention. Mr. Garrison is invention. Cartman is invention. Stan is invention. The kids and the parents and the teachers are all the show's own creations. The recurring real-world figures are, by contrast, mostly celebrities, mostly entertainers, mostly people drawn from outside the political class. Tom Cruise is a recurring real-world figure. Mel Gibson is sort of. Various pop stars and movie stars have been used and reused. But political figures, real ones, who appear as drawn versions of themselves and who recur across multiple episodes are rare. Saddam is one, Hillary Clinton is, in a smaller way, another, and in the 27th season, the current president has become the third. There is one more recurring presidential figure that we have not really discussed, and that is Al Gore. Al Gore was, of course, never president. He came as close as it is possible to come in the disputed election of 2000, and he then went on to become the public face of climate activism in the early years of the new century. The South Park version of Al Gore is one of the show's most particular and most loving caricatures. He appears in the famous Man Bear Pig episode, which aired in April of 2006, and in which he is shown as a man obsessed with hunting a creature called Man Bear Pig that he claims is a half-man, half-bear, half-pig that nobody else believes exists. The episode was widely read at the time as a satire of Gore's climate activism, and the comparison between Man Bear Pig and global warming was the joke that everybody took home. What is interesting about the Man Bear Pig episode, watching it back from the perspective of the present, is that the show has, in subsequent years, walked the joke back considerably. The Man Bear Pig character returned in a two-part episode in the 22nd season in 2018, and in those episodes, the show treated the creature as if it were real. Man Bear Pig, the show now said, had been real all along. Al Gore had been right. The kids had been wrong to mock him. The episodes were a striking apology from a show that does not usually apologize. The original Man Bear Pig episode had been the show's most prominent climate satire, and the later episodes were the show's open admission that the satire had aged badly. The show was willing to revisit, to revise, to update. The arc from the original Man Bear Pig to the later return is one of the most honest pieces of long-form self-correction in the show's history. Al Gore is, in some sense, the show's closest thing to a president it never had. He is treated across the run of the show almost as if he had been one. The cabinet imagery surrounds him. The presidential framing surrounds him. The fact that he became, in the public mind, the face of a kind of unfulfilled alternative future for the country gives him an almost presidential weight in the show's universe. He is, in the show's logic, the man who would have been president if the country had voted slightly differently, and the show treats him as such, even when it is making fun of him. There are other near presidents in the show. John McCain, who lost to Obama, becomes part of the South Park heist mythology in About Last Night. Mitt Romney, who lost to Obama in 2012, appears in a couple of references but is not really developed. Hillary Clinton, who lost to Trump in 2016, is woven into the season 20 arc and into various other episodes. The show has a soft spot for the people who almost became president. It treats them in many cases with more interest than it treats the people who actually became president. They are figures of an alternative country, and the show finds the alternative country sometimes more interesting than the actual one. This brings us to a question that the show has been quietly asking across all of these years, which is what the presidency is for. The show's argument, when you assemble it from across the run, is that the presidency is, in important respects, not really the thing the country thinks it is. The country thinks the presidency is the center of its political life. The show keeps suggesting that it is not. The show keeps suggesting that the center of the country's political life is elsewhere, in the cable news networks, in the comment sections, in the corporations, in the long, slow churn of the culture. The president, in the show's logic, is one figure among many, and the country's mistake is to put too much weight on him. You can see this in nearly every presidential episode the show has done. In the Bush episodes, the actual center of power is rarely Bush himself. The decisions get made by advisors, by cabinet members, by lobbyists, by the broader machinery. Bush is often a man being told what is happening rather than a man making it happen. In the Obama episodes, the same. In the Garrison episodes, the same. Garrison is rarely shown actually doing anything as president. He is shown being part of a situation that other forces are driving. The Biden episodes, what few there are, take this argument to its furthest extreme. The man at the top in those few moments is almost not in control of his own surroundings at all. He is being moved through scenes by people around him. The show's reading of this is, again, interpretation. The actual presidency may or may not be the kind of figurehead role that the show keeps drawing. Other readings are available. But the consistency of the reading across 30 years and across multiple administrations of both parties is striking. The show, regardless of who is in office, keeps drawing the same picture. The president is a man in a suit who is largely being moved by forces he does not fully control. This is the show's recurring argument. It is the argument that connects the Bush episodes to the Obama episodes, to the Garrison episodes, to the Biden episodes, to the new direct portrayals of the second Trump era. The man changes, the drawing of the man changes, the argument stays the same. You could call this a cynical view, and it is sometimes treated as such by people who write about the show. But the show itself does not present it as cynical. The show, when it draws the president as a function of larger forces, is not making a sneering point. It is making, in its own way, a kind of consoling point. The man in the office is just a man, the show is saying. The country is bigger than him. The country was here before him and will be here after him. The country's argument with itself will continue regardless of who happens to be standing at the podium. This is, in some readings, a deeply patriotic argument, although the show would never say so directly. It is an argument that the country is more durable than its politics, and that the politics, even at their loudest, are a smaller part of the country than the country itself. The show has been making this argument for 30 years, and it has been making it through every president that has held the office during that time, and it has been making it about presidents who held the office long before. This is the through line. This is what holds all of the show's presidential content together. The presidents in South Park are characters in a country that the show finds endlessly compelling. The country is the actual subject. The presidents are the masks the country wears. Let us take a slower walk now through some of the smaller presidential moments that we have not yet visited, because the show has hundreds of them scattered across its run, and they are part of the texture of the argument we have been describing. The show has done, over the years, a number of cold opens that involve presidents in passing. There are flashbacks to the Civil War in which Lincoln walks across the screen for a single beat. There are dream sequences in which a parade of past presidents marches through the back of the frame. There are scenes set in the National Mall, in the National Archives, in the Smithsonian, in which images of past presidents form the background to other action. The show has built itself by accretion a kind of low-key visual library of the American presidency, and that library has been used in dozens of episodes that are not really about any particular president. There is, for example, the episode called Pinewood Derby from the 13th season, which is largely about a Pinewood Derby car race, and which has, near the end, a scene set at an emergency United Nations gathering that includes various national leaders. The President of the United States is in that scene. He is treated in the way that the show always treats the office, as one voice among many. There is the episode called The Coon from the same season, in which the kids' superhero plotline includes brief references to the federal government and to the office of the president. There is the episode called Crippled Summer from the 14th season, which is largely a parody of the Special Olympics genre, but which has a passing scene involving the White House. There is the episode called In Sheepshin, also from the 14th season, which is a parody of the Inception film, and which dips briefly into a dream sequence involving political figures. None of these are presidential episodes in the way that the Bush or Garrison episodes are. They are episodes in which the president happens to be part of the scenery. The show has also done, at intervals, episodes that involve fictional presidents who do not correspond to any real person. There are sketches that involve imagined future presidents. There are stories set in alternate timelines in which different people occupy the office. The show is comfortable, when it needs to be, with inventing presidents wholesale in the same way that it is comfortable inventing entire countries. The fictional presidents are usually used to make a particular satirical point about American power, and they are usually played for broad jokes rather than for sustained character work. But they exist. They are part of the show's universe. The presidency in South Park is a role that can be filled by any number of characters, real or invented, and the show has filled it many times over the years. One particular category of fictional president worth noting is the recurring figure of the president drawn as a generic stock character, a man in a suit with gray hair who shows up in scenes set in the Oval Office without being meant to correspond to any specific president. This generic president has appeared in a number of episodes when the show has needed a president for a scene, but did not want to anchor the scene to any particular real administration. The generic president is usually used in cold opens or in flashbacks, and he is, in the show's visual logic, a kind of placeholder. He is the office without the man, and his recurring presence is itself a statement about how the show thinks about the role. There is also the figure of the vice president, which the show has used at various points to make sideways arguments about the actual administration. The vice presidents the show has drawn include a version of Dick Cheney, who was Bush's vice president and who appears in several episodes during the second Bush term, and a version of Joe Biden, who was Obama's vice president and who appears in a handful of scenes during the Obama era. These vice president cameos are usually played for the same flat absurdity that the show uses for any political figure, but they are interesting because they often function as the show's preferred way of getting at the administration without doing it through the president himself. The Bush-era show used Cheney as a way of doing Bush satire without quite doing Bush satire. The Obama-era show used Biden in a small way in the same fashion. The show was finding the vice president to be a useful satirical buffer between itself and the man in the actual office. The first ladies, similarly, have been drawn at various points. Laura Bush appears in scenes set in the White House. Michelle Obama appears in About Last Night and in scattered other moments. Melania Trump has been drawn into a couple of episodes in the second Trump era. The show treats the first ladies as part of the broader presidential package, with their own small recurring roles to play, but it has not built any of them into developed characters. They are, in the show's logic, part of the furniture of the presidency rather than independent figures. The show has also done, over the years, a number of episodes that involve former presidents in their post-presidential lives. There are scenes that imagine Bush in retirement. There are scenes that imagine Obama after office. There are scenes that imagine various other former presidents in various other settings. These post-presidential scenes are, almost without exception, played for the same kind of resigned comedy that the show uses for the office itself. The former president, in the show's logic, is a man who has worn the country's hat and who has had to put it down. And the show finds this transition interesting. The post-presidential life is, in some ways, what the show is actually arguing for. It is the show's version of how a president becomes a person again. There is a particular episode of the show from the early period that deserves a longer look in this context, and that is the episode called Sexual Harassment Panda from the third season, which aired in July of 1999. The episode is not, on its surface, about the presidency at all. It is about the kids and about a sexual harassment training character who teaches the children about lawsuits and about the country's relationship with its legal system. But the episode is, in a sideways way, the show's first real foray into political satire. And it is the episode that established the show's approach to the country's political system. The presidency in the episode is not present directly, but the broader machinery of which the presidency is the head, the system of laws, of regulations, of cultural training, of consultative experts, is present everywhere. The episode is reading the country as a machine that is, in some essential way, comically self-defeating. And the reading is the same reading that the show will later apply to every administration. Sexual Harassment Panda is, in this sense, the show's political prologue. Everything that the show would later do with presidents, with administrations, with the broader political machinery, is anticipated in that episode. The show was figuring out in 1999 what kind of political show it was going to be, and the answer it arrived at was that it was going to be a show about the country's relationship with its own machinery. The presidency would be part of the machinery. The presidents would be people who happened to be operating the controls. The country would be the actual subject, and the country's confused relationship with its own systems would be the actual drama. The production realities of South Park have shaped its presidential satire in ways that are worth pausing on, because they explain a lot of the choices the show has made. South Park, for most of its run, has been produced on a very short turnaround. The traditional schedule in the Comedy Central years was a 6-day production cycle, with the writer's room locking the script on a Thursday and the finished episode airing the following Wednesday. This is, by the standards of animation, an almost impossible schedule. Most animated shows lock their scripts months in advance, and the animation itself takes weeks. South Park, by virtue of its deliberately simple animation style and its small core team of animators, was able to compress the entire production process into a single week. The schedule is one of the show's defining features, and it has shaped every aspect of how the show works. The implication for presidential satire is enormous. South Park was able to react to political news the way a late-night talk show reacts to it, except in fully animated form. No other animated show could do this. The Simpsons, for all its political content, locks its episodes nearly a year in advance and cannot react to anything in real time. Family Guy, similarly, locks its episodes months ahead. South Park, alone among the major animated comedies, can do same-week satire. The About Last Night episode that aired the day after the Obama election is the most famous example of this capacity, but the show has used it for every major political moment of the past 30 years. The Sermon on the Mount episode about the second Trump term, the OGs episode about the first Trump election, the swift reactions to the surveillance revelations and to Hurricane Katrina. All of these are products of the same production system that allows the show to write about something on Monday and have it on television by Wednesday. The trade-off, of course, is that the show is sometimes wrong. When you write television in a week, you do not have time to step back and reconsider. The Man Bear Pig episode, which we discussed, is one example of a satire that the show later decided had been wrong. The OGs episode is another, in a different sense, because the show was writing while still in shock, and the result was an episode that was, by the show's own admission, not its best work. The fast schedule produces hot takes, and hot takes are sometimes hotter than they should be. The show has been honest about this. Parker and Stone have, in various interviews over the years, said that they regret particular episodes, that they would have written certain things differently, that the schedule sometimes forces choices that with more time they might have avoided. The Garrison Era arc, which we have spent a lot of time on, is the show's most ambitious attempt to use the fast schedule for sustained political satire. The arc ran across 2 full seasons, with each episode written in the week before it aired, and the entire arc designed to track the real campaign in real time. The arc almost worked. The Garrison plotline through the autumn of 2015 was, by general critical agreement, some of the show's strongest material in years. The plotline through the autumn of 2016 got broken by the election result in ways that we have discussed. The show learned a lesson from that experience, and the lesson was that the fast schedule has limits. You cannot reliably predict a national election. You cannot reliably structure a year-long arc around an expected outcome. The show, after season 20, scaled back its ambitions. It went back to standalone episodes for most of its political content, and it has stayed there with occasional exceptions ever since. The Paramount streaming era has changed the production realities again. The show's specials, which have been produced for Paramount Plus rather than for the weekly Comedy Central run, are made on a different schedule. They are made in months rather than in days. They are longer, more polished, more deliberate. The political content in them is correspondingly different. The specials tend to be about broader cultural movements rather than about specific weekly news. The pandemic special is about the pandemic as a long event. The streaming war special is about the streaming era as a long event. The Joining the Pandaverse special is about diversity as a long subject. The presidents barely appear in the specials because the specials are not designed for the kind of weekly reaction that produces presidential content. They are designed for slower, broader, more contemplative satire. This is one of the reasons the Biden era of South Park is so quiet. The Biden era was, in production terms, dominated by the specials. The regular weekly seasons during the Biden years were shorter than usual. The show was experimenting with the streaming model, and the weekly reaction television muscle was being used less. By the time the show returned to a more regular weekly schedule, in the 27th season, the president had changed and the country had moved into a different moment. The Biden era, in production terms, fell into the gap between the old Comedy Central model and the new streaming model, and the show's political output during those years was correspondingly thin. The new 27th season run has, by all appearances, returned to the older model. The episodes are being produced on something closer to the traditional weekly schedule. The political content is back to being a weekly reaction. The show is in the same posture it was in during the second Bush term, and the political content is comparable in intensity, although the targets are different. This is, in a way, the show coming home. The weekly schedule is what the show was built for. The weekly reaction is what the show does best. The new era has, in production terms, restored the show to the working model that produced its strongest political stretches. The cultural impact of South Park's presidential satire is harder to measure than the show's other impacts, partly because political satire is always entangled with the politics it satirizes, and partly because the show's own posture has been deliberately ambiguous. The show has been claimed at various points by every part of the American political spectrum. It has been claimed by the right as an anti-establishment, anti-political correctness show. It has been claimed by the left as a sharp critic of the Bush administration and of the Trump administration. It has been claimed by libertarians as a show that is fundamentally suspicious of all government. It has been claimed by centrists as a show that is fundamentally suspicious of partisan extremity in all its forms. All of these claims have a certain amount of truth in them. None of them, on their own, captures what the show actually does. What the show actually does when you look at the full run is take seriously the idea that the country is more interesting than its politicians. The presidential episodes, viewed individually, look like partisan jokes. The presidential episodes, viewed together as a 30-year project, look like a single sustained meditation on the country itself. The show is not trying to convince you of any particular political position. It is trying to convince you that the country is a strange, contradictory, often comic, often touching, perpetually self-arguing organism, and that the presidents are interesting mainly as symptoms of the country's mood at any given moment. This is, you could argue, the most consistent political vision in American long-form animation, and it is one of the things that has kept the show on the air for as long as it has been. The show's relationship with the actual presidents it has drawn is, as far as anyone outside the writer's room can tell, mostly distant. Parker and Stone have, in interviews over the years, said that they have heard from various administrations, that various presidents and former presidents have responded to the show in various ways, but the specifics are vague. There are stories, some confirmed and some less so, of administrations being unhappy with particular episodes. There are stories of administrations being amused by particular episodes. The show has, by and large, kept these stories at arm's length, treating them as part of the broader noise of being a long-running television show rather than as substantive engagements with the political class. The second Trump era has changed this slightly. The response from the current White House to the 27th season has been more direct and more public than the responses from previous administrations. There has been a public exchange of sorts. The show has responded to the response. The administration has responded to the response to the response. The whole thing has, at moments, taken on the character of a sustained dialogue between the show and the president, which is something that has not really happened in the show's previous presidential eras. The Bush administration largely ignored the show in public. The Obama administration largely ignored the show in public. The Biden administration largely ignored the show in public. The current administration has not ignored the show, and the show has not ignored it back. And the result has been one of the more unusual cultural arguments of the past several years. There is a question, which we may as well raise, about what the show is going to do after this. South Park is now an unusually long-running show by the standards of American animation. The Simpsons has run longer, but no other show is comparable. South Park is in its 27th season, has done several hour-long specials, and has, by most accounts, a confirmed production schedule running for several more years. The show's presidential satire is going to continue. The question is what shape it is going to take. If the pattern of the past 30 years holds, the show will continue to satirize the country through whoever is in office, with the intensity of the satire calibrated to the intensity of the political moment. If the country settles into a quieter period, the satire will quieten. If the country enters another loud period, the satire will get louder. The show is, in this respect, a kind of barometer. It rises and falls with the pressure of the political moment. The Bush years were a loud period and the show was loud. The Obama years were a quieter period and the show was quieter. The first Trump years were a kind of confused, mixed period, and the show was correspondingly confused. The Biden years were a recovery period and the show was correspondingly subdued. The second Trump years are a loud period again and the show is loud again. This pattern, which is interpretation rather than fact, suggests something about the show that is worth saying. The show is not, in itself, a generator of political energy. It is a reflector of political energy. It picks up what the country is putting out and gives it back, often amplified, often distorted, often misunderstood, but recognizably tied to what the country was doing in the first place. This is, in a way, what all satire is. But South Park does it on a particularly accelerated cycle, and the cycle means that the show ends up being a fairly accurate record of the country's mood at any given moment. You can tell what kind of year the country was having by watching what kind of episodes the show was putting out. The episodes are, in this respect, a kind of running diary of American political feeling, and the diary has been kept now for almost 30 years. The most fascinating thing about that diary, when you read it from beginning to end, is how little has actually changed in the country's underlying disposition. The country of 2003, watching I'm a Little Bit Country, was arguing with itself about whether to go to war and whether to protest the war. The country of 2025, watching the new direct portrayal episodes, is arguing with itself about a different war in a different way, but the structure of the argument is recognizably the same. The country of 1999, watching Sexual Harassment Panda, was arguing with itself about its own machinery, its own regulations, its own systems of self-correction. The country of 2025, watching the new season, is still arguing with itself about the same things. The president's change. The arguments do not much. This is again the show's reading. It is a reading you can disagree with, but it is the consistent reading that the show has been advancing for 30 years, and the consistency is striking. The country, the show keeps saying, is a more permanent thing than its politicians. The country's argument with itself is a more permanent thing than any particular round of the argument. The presidents are temporary figures. The country is the thing that endures. And the country, in the show's affectionate but unsparing portrait, is a strange, contradictory, often ridiculous, often beautiful place that keeps producing presidents who think they are the center of it, and that keeps gently showing them that they are not. If you have watched all of the show's political content in order, which is something only a small number of viewers have probably done, you can see this argument develop. The early seasons are tentative about it. The Bush years sharpen it. The Obama years take it in a more contemplative direction. The Garrison years apply it to a particular kind of populist moment. The Biden years quiet it down. The new direct era is reasserting it in a louder register. The argument is the same throughout. The country is the subject. The presidents are the symptoms. The show is interested in the country. There is one more president we should mention, although we have already covered most of his content, and that is the man currently in the office. The show's portrayal of him, in the 27th season episodes that have aired so far, is the most sustained piece of direct presidential satire the show has done since the Bush years. The episodes are committed, they are sharp. They are also, in places, surprisingly tender, in the way the show's satire often is when you look closely. The show is drawing the president as a recognizable man in a recognizable office, doing recognizable things. The drawing is, as ever, the show's reading of the moment. Other readings are available, but the show's commitment to the satire is total in a way that it has not been since the Bush years, and the episodes have the same energy that the Bush episodes had in their prime. What this is going to look like in retrospect 10 years from now is something we cannot know. The Bush episodes, viewed at the time, looked like sharp partisan satire. Viewed now, they look like quieter, more sympathetic portraits of a particular American moment. The Garrison episodes, viewed at the time, looked like partisan satire of one candidate. Viewed now, they look like the show's anticipation of a broader populist shift in American politics. The current episodes will presumably look different 10 years from now than they look right now. The pattern of the show is that its political content ages into something more complicated than it appears to be at the time of broadcast. The current episodes will probably age the same way. They will probably look, in 10 years, less like partisan attacks and more like portraits of a particular moment in the country's life. The show has done this before. It will probably do it again. Let us look more closely at a few particular episodes that we have only briefly mentioned, because the closer you look at any one of them, the more the show's relationship with the presidency comes into focus. The Douche and Turd episode from October of 2004 is, on first viewing, a short and brutal piece of election year cynicism. On closer inspection, it is something more interesting. The episode is structurally an argument between Stan and the rest of the town. Stan does not want to vote. The town wants him to vote. The town's argument, when you listen to it carefully, is not really about the merits of the two candidates for school mascot. It is about the obligation to participate, about the social contract of voting, about the idea that not voting is itself a kind of betrayal. Stan's argument, similarly, is not really about the merits of the candidates. It is about the futility he feels when neither candidate represents him. The episode lets both arguments have their full weight. It does not pretend that Stan is wrong. It does not pretend that the town is wrong. The closing scene, when Stan finally votes, is not played as a triumph. It is played as a small, exhausted acceptance. The episode is, on this reading, one of the most ambivalent pieces of political television in the show's run. It is making the case for voting and the case against voting in the same scene, and it is letting the audience choose which case to hear. This is, on a deeper reading, what the show does for almost every political issue it touches. It lays out the cases, it picks at all of them, it leaves the choosing to you. The line about giant douches and turd sandwiches has, as we said, escaped the episode and entered the country's vocabulary. But the episode itself is more careful than the line suggests. The episode is, in the end, not a recommendation to abstain. It is a meditation on what voting feels like when you do not love either choice. The mystery of the urinal deuce episode from October of 2006 is similarly more complicated than its surface suggests. The episode is structured as a parody of the conspiracy genre, with Stan being recruited into an investigation that takes him through layers of supposed truth. Each layer, when it is reached, turns out to be itself a fabrication, and the final reveal, that the government has been engineering the conspiracy theories themselves in order to make the country fear them, is itself in the episode partly a fabrication. The episode goes around in circles. It refuses to land on any single explanation. It ends with Stan being told that the simplest explanation, the official one, the one that the conspiracy theorists reject, is in fact the true one, and that the conspiracy theories are themselves the dangerous fiction. What is happening in this episode, beneath the parody, is a serious argument about how the country relates to its own government. The episode is reading the country as a place that has become so distrustful of its institutions that it would rather believe the institutions are guilty of anything, even the worst things, than accept the simple official explanation of any disaster. The episode is critical of this tendency. It is also sympathetic to it. The president in the episode is presented as a man who is partly responsible for the country's distrust and partly a victim of it. He is exhausted by the conspiracy theories. He is exhausted by the country that produces them. He is exhausted by the office. He is, in the closing scene, a man who knows that no matter what he says, half the country will not believe him, and that this is the condition of being president in the country he is governing. This is, again, the show's reading. Other readings are available. But it is a more careful and more sympathetic portrait of the office than the surface of the episode suggests, and it is consistent with what the show does with the office in all its other appearances. The president in Mystery of the Urinal Deuce is the model for almost every later presidential portrait the show would do. The exhausted man at the desk, partly responsible and partly bewildered, partly a villain and partly a victim, is the role that the show has assigned to the presidency, and the role gets played by different actors in different administrations. The About Last Night episode from November of 2008, which we have already covered, is interesting also for what it implies about the show's view of campaigns. The premise is that the campaign was a cover for a heist, but the deeper joke is that all campaigns are, in some sense, performances designed to obscure the actual workings of power. The Obama character in the episode is not the Obama of the campaign trail. He is a private man, a competent operator who has been wearing the public persona for years. The McCain character is the same. The two of them are, in the episode's logic, professionals who have been doing the campaign as a job, and who now, with the job complete, can take off the masks and get on with the work. What the work is in the episode is the heist, but the heist is plainly a metaphor. The episode is suggesting that the actual work of being president is something the country never sees, and that the campaign is the visible part of an iceberg of activity that goes on behind the scenes. This is, in some sense, a defense of the political class. It is suggesting that the politicians are not the buffoons that they sometimes appear to be on television, that they are in fact competent professionals who have been concealing their competence for strategic reasons. This is, again, the show's reading. It is also a more flattering reading of the political class than the show usually offers. About Last Night is, in this respect, one of the show's most unusual political episodes because it is the show in a comparatively generous mood. The Garrison era episodes, especially the ones from the autumn of 2015, are interesting because they show the show in the act of misreading the political moment. The early Garrison episodes are written with the assumption that the candidate they are parodying will lose. The episodes are structured around that assumption. The arc is designed to land on a moment of relief, when the country will have made the right choice and the show will have been vindicated in its anxiety. The election did not provide that landing. The arc had to be rewritten. The show in the early Garrison episodes was making a particular kind of cultural argument that the country did not in the end validate. What is striking about the Garrison episodes, in retrospect, is how clearly the show was anticipating the cultural shift that the election would later confirm. The early Garrison episodes are not unaware of the candidate's appeal. They show the rallies, they show the cheering crowds, they show the moderate voices failing to land. The episodes are, in some sense, a warning. The show was suggesting, throughout the autumn of 2015, that the country was in the grip of something it did not fully understand, and that the political class was failing to take the warning seriously. The election, when it came, proved the show partly right and partly wrong. The candidate did win, which the show had warned was possible. The country did not, in the longer run, respond the way the early episodes had suggested it might. The Garrison arc is, in this respect, one of the show's most honest pieces of political satire, because it shows the show getting it half right and half wrong, in real time, on television, without the chance to rewrite history afterwards. The Oh Geez episode, which aired the day after the actual election, is one of the strangest pieces of television in the show's run. The episode was, as we said, hastily rewritten after the result came in, and the rewriting is visible. There are seams in the episode. There are moments where the original plot is still trying to assert itself, and other moments where the new plot has been imposed on top of it. The episode does not entirely make sense as a piece of storytelling, but as a document of a particular night in American history, it has a peculiar power. The show is, in real time, processing the result. The characters are, in real time, working through what has happened. The episode is, in some sense, the country's reaction in animation form, broadcast within hours of the country having that reaction. There is almost nothing else in television like it. The episodes that followed, Oh Geez, through the rest of the 20th season are similarly a document of the show trying to recover from a result it had not planned for. The plotlines try to redirect themselves. The arc tries to find a new landing. The show, in the late episodes of the season, is visibly improvising. It is also visibly grappling with the question of what kind of show it is going to be in the new political moment. The choice that the show eventually made, which is to scale back the sustained political arcs and return to standalone episodes, was made in the months after season 20, and you can see the choice being made, episode by episode, in those late season 20 installments. The show is trying out different postures. It is figuring out what is going to work. The episodes of the 21st season in 2017 show the new posture in action. The political content is more scattered. The Garrison appearances are briefer. The plot lines are about other things. The show is doing what it had done in the Obama era, which is to say it is treating the presidency as one element of a broader cultural fabric rather than as the central subject of every other episode. The 21st season has the long arc about white supremacy, about the national anthem, about the events that were defining the first year of the new administration without quite being directly attributable to the president himself. The show is, in a way, doing Bush-era satire all over again. It is reading the country through the era rather than through the man. This is the posture that the show maintains through the rest of the first Trump administration. The 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th seasons all operate in something close to the same mode. The Garrison president is in the background. The country is in the foreground. The episodes are about culture, about technology, about race, about media, about the broader things that the show has always been about, with the presidency as one element of the wider picture. The show, having decided after season 20 that the sustained arc model was not working, returned to its older method and stayed there for almost a decade. The Biden era we have covered. The new direct era we have covered. What we should say one more time before turning to the outro is that the show's relationship with the office of the presidency has been, across the full run, more thoughtful and more layered than its detractors have sometimes given it credit for. The show has been accused at various points of being too partisan, of being too unpartisan, of being too cynical, of being too sentimental, of being too cruel, of being too soft. Most of these accusations have been made by people who have only seen a few episodes. The show, viewed as a single 30-year project, is a more careful and more humane piece of political satire than its reputation sometimes suggests. It has drawn the presidents with a kind of resigned affection. It has drawn the country with the same. It has refused, in most cases, to take a side in the country's ongoing argument with itself. It has, in its own way, kept faith with the country, even when the country has been in its worst moods. There is, finally, one more thing to say about the show's relationship with the office, and it is that the show has, across its entire run, drawn the office itself, the Oval Office, the desk, the seal on the floor, the curtains, the flag, with a remarkable consistency. The Oval Office in Season 7 looks like the Oval Office in Season 27. The desk is in the same place, the flag is in the same place, the window behind the desk is in the same place. The show has, by accident or design, treated the office itself as a permanent set, a piece of national furniture that does not change regardless of who is sitting in the chair. The chair changes, the set does not. This is, in some sense, the show's most consistent political statement. The office endures, the country endures, the men come and go, the chair stays. When you have watched all of the show's presidential content in order, you start to see this set as the show's actual main character. The Oval Office in South Park is more recurring than any single president. It has been there since the early seasons. It has been there in the new direct era. It will presumably be there in whatever the show does next. The presidents pass through it. The set remains. The country, in the show's logic, is the set. The presidents are the actors. The show is interested in the set. And the set, for all the show's mockery, is treated with a kind of quiet respect. The show does not deface it. The show does not destroy it. The show does not, in any of its presidential episodes, suggest that the office itself should be abolished. The show, even at its most cynical, is operating within the assumption that the office will continue to exist, that the country will continue to have a president, that the chair will continue to be occupied by somebody. The show's argument, when you assemble it, is about who occupies the chair and how, not about whether the chair should exist. This is, in its own way, a deeply conservative position, although the show would never describe it as such. The show believes, you could say, in the office. It just does not always believe in the people who fill it. This is where we should stop, because everything else we could say from here would be a variation on what we have already said. The show's relationship with the American presidency across 30 years and 7 administrations and dozens of historical figures and 100 different episodes is a single sustained argument about the country, the office, and the human beings who try to inhabit both. The argument is unfinished. The show is still on the air. The country is still arguing with itself. The chair is still occupied. The set is still standing. There will be more episodes. There will be more presidents. There will be more of whatever this is. Before we close, there are a few smaller threads in the show's presidential history that deserve a little of our attention because they are part of what makes the run feel as rich as it does. One of them is the way the show treats elections themselves as opposed to the presidents that elections produce. Elections in South Park are almost always presented as comic events, full of ridiculous theater and absurd choices, but they are also presented as oddly serious. The town in the show treats its elections, when they happen, with a kind of unwarranted gravity. The kids treat their elections with even more. Stan and Kyle and Cartman and Kenny, as they age across the run of the show, become voters, theoretically, in the world of the show, although the show has carefully kept them at 4th grade age for the entire run. But in the world of the adults around them, elections happen, and the show has, at intervals, drawn the rituals of Election Day with a particular care. The polling stations, the yard signs, the cable news coverage, the election night anxiety, the morning after. This pattern is something the show inherited partly from the older American sitcom tradition. The episodes of various long-running shows that have aired around election times have always included some kind of nod to the ritual of voting. South Park has done this too, in its own way, although it has done it with more bite than most other shows. The recurring image across the run is of the country going through the ritual without quite believing in it, and the ritual being in some way valuable anyway. The show is, at its quietest, making the same argument that the closing scene of Douche and Turd makes. Voting matters even when you do not love your choices. The country survives even when it does not always make the best choice. The ritual is part of how the country survives. Another smaller thread worth mentioning is the show's treatment of the various people around the president, the chiefs of staff, the press secretaries, the advisors, the cabinet members. The show has, across its run, drawn dozens of these figures, sometimes as recognizable real-world people, and sometimes as generic invented ones. The pattern is consistent. The advisors and the cabinet members are, in the show's drawing, usually more competent than the president, more in control of the actual workings of the government, and more cynical about what they are doing. This is, again, the show's reading, and it is partly the show's version of a long-established trope in American political fiction. The show is interested in the layer beneath the president, and it has been drawing that layer for as long as it has been drawing presidents. The First Lady, similarly, gets a careful but not extensive treatment. Laura Bush is drawn in scenes in the Bush years. Michelle Obama is drawn in About Last Night and in some other moments. The show has, in the second Trump era, included the current First Lady in some of its scenes. The First Lady, in the show's logic, tends to be drawn as a figure of relatively dignified resignation, somebody who has ended up in a strange position, not entirely of her choosing, and is doing her best to inhabit it. This is, again, interpretation, and the show is not consistent about it across every appearance, but the pattern is recognizable. The Secret Service, the Marine Guards, the various uniformed figures of the executive branch are also a recurring part of the show's presidential machinery. They are usually drawn as competent, polite, and slightly menacing in the way that the show draws most uniformed authority figures. They tend to appear in the background of scenes set in the White House, and they tend to be silent. The show is not particularly interested in them as characters, but their consistent presence is part of what gives the show's Oval Office scenes their particular texture. The chair is occupied by a president. The set is filled with uniformed figures. The country, in the show's logic, is a set with a lot of permanent staff and a rotating cast of leads. The international perspective on South Park's presidential satire is also worth a brief word because the show has, over its long run, been broadcast in dozens of countries, and the international audience for the show's American political content has been substantial. The show was, for many years, one of the more popular American animated comedies in Europe, in Latin America, and parts of Asia. Audiences outside the United States have, in many cases, watched the show's presidential satire as a kind of guide to American politics, a window into how Americans were thinking about their own leaders. This is, of course, only one perspective on the country, and the show has been honest that it is the show's perspective rather than any official one. But the international reception of the show's political content is a part of the show's cultural footprint, and it has in some real ways shaped how the world has seen American politics over the past 3 decades. The show was banned, as we mentioned, in mainland China after the Banned in China episode of 2019, and that ban has, by all accounts, remained in place. The show is not, in any case, the kind of show that is going to make peace with the Chinese government, and the writers have been clear that they are comfortable with the consequences. The show has also had complicated relationships with various other governments over the years. There have been moments when various administrations of various countries have objected to particular episodes. The show has, in most cases, treated these objections the way it treats American objections, which is to say, it has not particularly responded to them. The show is, by temperament and by policy, comfortable with being unpopular in places it does not wish to ingratiate itself. The American presidents, when they have been the subject of the show's satire, have sometimes responded in their own ways. Some have made public statements, some have made private statements that have, over time, become public. Some have ignored the show entirely. The pattern of response has, broadly speaking, tracked the pattern of the show's intensity. When the show has been doing sustained, weekly, direct satire of an administration, the administration has tended to respond more visibly. When the show has been doing scattered, oblique, indirect satire, the administration has tended to ignore it. This is, in some sense, the bargain of the show. Direct satire produces direct response. Indirect satire produces indirect response. The show has chosen, in different eras, which kind of satire to do, and the responses have followed accordingly. There is one final thread that we should pull, because it is the thread that ties the whole run together, and it is the question of what the show actually believes about the country. We have said more than once that the show is more interested in the country than in any particular president, and that the country is the show's actual subject. What we have not quite said is what the show believes about the country itself. The honest answer when you watch the full run is that the show believes the country is, in the end, a fundamentally decent place that keeps making bad choices for understandable reasons. This is, you could argue, the show's deepest political position. It is not a position that fits comfortably into any of the standard American political ideologies. It is not a partisan position. It is not a libertarian position. It is not a conservative or liberal position in the conventional sense. It is, instead, a position that you could call, for lack of a better word, affectionately disappointed. The show is disappointed in the country, regularly, episode after episode. The country keeps electing the wrong people. The country keeps believing the wrong things. The country keeps falling for the wrong arguments. The show registers this disappointment, satirizes it, makes jokes about it, but the show keeps coming back. 30 years of episodes is a long commitment to a country you do not love. The fact that the show has stayed on the air for as long as it has, and that it has kept making episodes about the country and its politicians for as long as it has, is itself an act of affection. The show would not bother to satirize the country if the show did not, on some level, care about the country. The satire is the affection. The disappointment is the affection. The 30-year commitment to drawing the same town with the same kids in the same country under one president after another is the affection. This is, in the end, what makes the show's presidential satire feel different from other kinds of political satire that you can find on television. Most political satire is delivered with an undertone of disgust. The country is presented as a place that has gone wrong and that needs to be set right. South Park does not mostly do this. South Park, in its presidential episodes, treats the country as a place that has always been the way it is, that is always going to be the way it is, and that has mixed in with all its absurdities, a kind of stubborn endurance that the show finds quietly admirable. The country, in the show's logic, keeps producing presidents. The presidents keep being insufficient. The country keeps surviving anyway. This is, in some sense, the country's most consistent achievement, and the show has been documenting that achievement for 30 years. So when you watch the next presidential episode that the show puts out, whenever that happens, in whatever administration is in office at that point, what you will be watching is one more entry in this long documentation. The president on the screen will be a temporary figure. The country in the background will be the actual subject. The show will be, as it has always been, the show, doing what it has done for 3 decades, and what it will presumably continue to do, for as long as the network keeps paying for it and the writers keep wanting to make it. The argument will be the same. The country will be the country. The presidents will be the presidents. The chair will be the chair. The set will be the set. That is what South Park's relationship with every American president, from George Washington to the man currently in office, actually looks like when you stand back and take it in as a single thing. It is not a partisan project. It is not a destructive project. It is, in the best moments, a kind of national portrait, drawn slowly, week by week, over 30 years, by a small team of people who are deeply interested in the country they live in. The portrait is unflattering. The portrait is also affectionate. The portrait is the show's gift to the country, even when the country has not quite known how to receive it. And the portrait is, almost certainly, not yet finished. When the show finally ends, whenever that is, the portrait will be one of the longer-running pieces of political television in the country's history. By that time, more presidents will have come and gone. More elections will have happened. More controversies will have been recorded. The basic structure of the portrait will remain the same. The country in the show will still be the country in the show. The chair will still be the chair. The set will still be the set. The presidents will still be the temporary figures who pass through. The country will still endure. And the show, having documented all of this with the patience of a portrait painter, will have done something that no other animated comedy has quite done, and that no other show is likely to do again. So that is the long story, the full run, the whole 30-year project walked through from Washington to the man at the desk right now. The dead presidents in the museum scenes, the founding fathers in the dream sequence, the Lincoln in the flashback, the Kennedy in the conspiracy, the Nixon in the dark wood-paneled office, the Clinton in the background of Janet Reno's adventures, the Bush at the desk in the basement of the White House, the Obama in the bow tie at the heist, the Garrison at the podium, the Biden glimpsed at the edge of a couple of frames, the man currently on the screen, drawn directly in episodes that are airing as we speak, all of them, one after the other, treated with the same calm, the same flat construction paper aesthetic, the same affectionately disappointed eye. If you have made it this far through the script, you have done what only the most patient viewers ever do, which is sit with the full run and look at it as a single picture rather than as a collection of episodes. The picture is, you could argue, more interesting than any single episode. The picture is the show's actual achievement. The picture is what the show has been quietly assembling week by week since 1997, and the picture is what we have been walking through tonight. The picture is, in the end, a portrait of a country and its presidents, told in cartoons with all the strange and contradictory affection that a 30-year cartoon can muster. There is a particular thing that happens when you watch a long-running television show for as long as South Park has been on the air. The country in the show starts to feel like a real country. The town in the show starts to feel like a real town. The characters in the show start to feel like people you have known for 30 years, because in a way you have. And the presidents, drawn one after the other across that long run, start to feel like a particular kind of recurring character themselves, a role that gets recast every 4 or 8 years, a chair that gets a new occupant, a set that endures while the cast rotates. This is, in some sense, the show's most distinctive contribution to how Americans think about their own political life. The show has trained its long-term audience to see the presidency as a long-running role rather than as a series of discrete events. The role continues, the actors change. So when you go to bed tonight, or whenever you finish listening to this, and you turn off the lights, and you let the long voice of the cartoon settle into your sleep, what you are sleeping with is one of the longer and stranger pieces of political portraiture that American television has produced. The show is not finished, the country is not finished, the chair is not finished, the next president has not yet been elected, and the one after that has not yet been born, and the one after that has not yet been imagined. The show will probably still be there, doing what it does when those presidents arrive. The portrait will keep being painted, the country will keep being argued with, the chair will keep being occupied. And somewhere, in the back of the frame, the marble bust of George Washington will still be sitting on the shelf, the way it has been sitting since the very first time the show needed a founding father watching the latest occupant of the chair pass through. If you enjoyed this long walk through every president that South Park has ever drawn, from the founders to the man on the screen right now, then please consider letting Papertown know by subscribing, because these long, deep dives are what we are here to make, and your support is genuinely what makes them possible. Thank you sincerely for spending this long stretch of the night with us. Sleep well, the country will still be here in the morning, and so will the chair, and so will the show, and so will we. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.